The last topic I want to discuss in this chapter on nutrition and food is the idea of food security and the availability of agricultural land. So the concept of food security has three components to it. One is food availability, which is just having enough of the food on a consistent basis near you. And then we have food access, which is to make sure that you have resources to get to the food. So even if you have lots of food available, but if there's a huge amount of geographical challenge to get to the food, then it's the same as not having the food. And then the last part is just the use of the food, which is to appropriately prepare it or eat it in a way that would extract the nutrients that are needed for our lives. Now, we have discussed the idea of undernourishment, which is just the lack of food. In North America and Europe, only less than 2.5% of the population is undernourished, but this is much worse in Africa and Asia, where there are approximately 20% of undernourishment occurring in some parts of the continents. There are two methods that we have used to increase the amount of food available. One is just to plant more crops, so using more land. And then the other one is to use the same amount of land, but try to increase the yield of the crop. So just make the crop produce a lot more from the same land. Neither one of these method is going to be able to solve our problem because the world's land that could be farmed is getting smaller and smaller. And then for increasing crop yields, typically we deal with that by using pesticides to kill the pests that take away some of the yield. And this also generates a cost to our environment, as some of these pesticides are not as easily breakable and also might contaminate our food supply and water, as we discussed in prior chapters. Increasing the amount of land that's used for agriculture also connects to other issue in addition to just the earth having a limited amount of land. Some of these issues are the loss of forest ecosystems because we keep cutting down trees to make land for farming. We also take away the topsoil of much of the earth because of the overplanting and overgrazing of these land. And the topsoil contains the most nutrients. And so once they're eroded or taken away, it takes a long time to replenish those nutrients in the soil. And then lastly, we lose the biodiversity of plants from the repeated planting of the same crop again and again and again, for example, corn. The other issue that we notice is that a lot of grain is needed to produce meat. So you may wonder how production of meat requires a large quantity of grain. Well, think about it. All of these animals that are shown here, which is the sources of meat that we eat, they themselves eat a lot of grain. Here are some numbers for the production of 1 kilogram of each of these meat, whether it's beef, pork, or chicken, and we also have some dairies here. But just look at beef here. It's 20 kilograms of feed is needed to make 1 kilogram of beef. So that's just about 2.2 pounds of beef. And as more and more countries have people who are becoming more affluent, the consumption of meat has gone up, which of course means the production of grain to feed the animals have to also go up. And that happens particularly quickly in the past 30 years or so, because there's some major countries that are developing very quickly during that period of time. Looking at the quantity of feed that's needed to produce all of these different types of meat, we can actually make a simple calculation to see what each person will consume in equivalent quantities of grain if this is what they're eating. This is based on data that I got from the Food and Agriculture Organization, or FAO, which is a branch of the UN. And a typical person would eat the following: 10 kilograms of beef. This is all annual numbers. 15 kilograms of pork and 17 kilograms of chicken. If you want to convert this to pounds, you can just multiply them all by 2.2 pounds per kilogram. if you do the calculation using the numbers from here in terms of the amount of grain needed, so for example, if it's 10 kilogram of beef and we need 20 kilograms of grain per kilogram of beef, we can multiply that across and get 200 kilograms of grain just to produce the amount of beef that's needed by one person each year. If you add all the numbers together, you get about 357 kilograms of grain that's needed just for one person. Now, if you multiply this by the estimated 8 billion people that we would have by around 2030, this will require production of 2.9 trillion kilogram of grain, and this is just so that we can produce enough meat for everybody to eat. We're not talking about grain that's needed for its own consumption, because people still eat grain, right? And other uses, maybe for production of ethanol and so on. Just to give you a comparison, total grain production in the world was only 2.3 trillion kilogram in 2017. Now, granted, at this point, we probably have improved these numbers, but it would be really unlikely that we would be able to meet that high of a number, which is another 600 billion kilogram of grain by 2030. So one of the possible solutions is to eat less meat, right, and switch to a more vegetable-based diet. In fact, a bunch of research has been done on this, and one from Carnegie Mellon University shows that if you just replace one meal from meat to just vegetable, it's equal to saving 1,200 miles of driving annually. Now, how does that work? There's a lot of things that you need to do with animals, like transporting them, selling, and taking them to like places where the meat is processed. All of these take fuel and energy to process, whereas with vegetable, there's a lot less processing, a lot less waste being discarded. It produces much less emission in carbon dioxide, which is how these miles are being measured. If you eat something that's locally produced, that's going to even save more miles, because the transportation it takes to take the food to you is a lot shorter. Imagine if you're trying to eat some meat that has to be imported from another country to the country that you live in, for example, in the United States. There's cost of the fuel from the plane. There is the cost of gasoline in the truck that's transporting that meat. There's the cost of refrigeration, overall generating a lot of combustion energy. And we can take a look at this plot to close off this discussion, which is to consider different types of food that we eat and how much of the equivalent of carbon dioxide that it is generating. And you can see that for each kilogram of red meat, that generates the most amount of carbon dioxide compared to 1 kilogram of all of these other types of food, right? Dairy products, fruit and vegetable, pretty low right here, right? For fruit and vegetable. Chicken, fish, and eggs and dairy products are number 2 and number 3 higher as compared to the red meat. So that just points out to you that if you can switch, not necessarily in a super drastic way, but just maybe one meal, that will help a lot in reducing carbon emission, and overall will also help not to increase global warming at such a fast speed.